Wow, a completely mid upgrade to my favorite mid unit? This is exactly what Pyro Traveler needed. He's saved. Hello. Okay, maybe that intro was a little bit mean. In fact, I went back and forth for a pretty decent amount of time deciding if I even wanted to do a video, because I did a testing live stream and was, again, thoroughly whelmed, but my PMC video is still my best performing by far, and both the follow-up video and the testing live stream got a fair bit of attention, so I think it's at least worth talking about in a more condensed form. And yeah, heads up, this is probably going to be a little more talky, a little less play-y. So anyways, to start off with a refresher, PyroMC has both fake and real constellations. I'm not going to bother censoring the name, so consider this your spoiler warning. When fighting the weekly boss in 5.3, they unlock all 6 constellations by default, but they only have this first half of the constellation that is above this line. And all those constellations start with the sentence, "When opposing the Lord of Eroded Primal Fire, incarnated by the soy sauce," which means they'll only take effect in this domain, nowhere else in the game. And you can see, this domain sucks. I don't even farm it. It's not fun. So the only place these constellations are taking any effect is one of the worst fights in the game. Yippee. What is below this line are the real constellations. I went over the original 5 in my 101. They're all pretty meh, kind of what you would expect from Traveler constellations. And while I was maybe a little harsh on C6, while it's not the best, I think it's easily the most interesting. It gives you an infusion that can't be overridden when you're in your Night Soul's Blessing state. Those attacks will deal Night Soul aligned damage, and your normal charged and plunging crit damage is increased by 40%. It allows you to use your Pyro Traveler as a dedicated Onfielder, which is pretty cool. They're not a great Onfielder, but it functions. But before we get more into team building, I want to break this constellation down into its 3 parts and talk about the least to most impactful aspects of it. Funnily enough, the least impactful, in my opinion, is the infusion. Am I ordering it in this way because this is the most inflammatory? Yes. Do I also somewhat believe it? Yes. I say somewhat because this is something that's subject to change based on your account. The reason being that in most Pyro Traveler Onfielder teams, you're already running Bennett, which of course the infamous C6 grants you a Pyro infusion. Now it's possible that you don't have this constellation or you refuse to activate it, but you should activate it. In either of those cases, Pyro Traveler's infusion obviously makes a bit more of a difference. Specifically for the former, if you don't have Bennett C6, it's nice that Pyro Traveler circumvents the need for it. But if you do have C6, there aren't a lot of situations in which you would be on-fielding Pyro Traveler without using Bennett. And of course, Ian-san has come out since that original video. C6 Pyro Traveler lets you use her as your attack buffer and maintain your infusion, but for a few reasons that I'll get into in a bit, I generally prefer Bennett. Anyways, the second most and also second least impactful aspect is that these attacks are Night Soul aligned. From a team building perspective, that only really affects Ororon. His A1 passive is currently the only thing in the game that triggers off of your teammates dealing Night Soul aligned damage. Your skill is already doing Night Soul aligned damage, so it's really not that big of a deal. However, more importantly, as I showed off in my video about Void Wards, this infusion makes PyroMC a ward-breaking fiend. He can shred through these things like nobody's business. Anyways, that leaves the most impactful part of the constellation as the crit damage buff, which honestly, I'm surprised I felt it as much as I did. Even though it's only applied to your normal charged and plunging attacks, 40% crit damage is nothing to scoff at, especially on a character who can use Obsidian Codex and reach 100% crit rate fairly easily. It's a nearly unconditional buff. There are very few hits that won't be getting applied on. Anyways, let's get into some team stuff. As you can see, this is still my preferred team for DPS PMC. Surprise, surprise, Hydro Wheelchair is strong. It doesn't play any differently from before. but obviously C6 is a nice upgrade, and I've also leveled some talents, so you'll get to see some higher numbers. Lucky you. Because this isn't a new team, I want to take a bit to talk about PMC's combos. It was brought to my attention in not actually the testing livestream, but my most recent Yanfei livestream. The Traveler, along with a lot of other sword characters in the game, have shared ICD between their normal and charged attacks. So the optimal combo to vape the largest hit of your normal attacks, which it's not the 5 hit damage, you're never gonna do 5 normal attacks in a row. It's actually the second hit of your charged attack. Your optimal combo for that is to do 2 normals into a charged attack once, and then spam 1 normal and a charged attack. And yeah, I did make a joke about this being a wheelchair team, but Pyro MC certainly is no slouch here. And you may have seen it can be easy to mess up your optimal combo based on how the enemy is moving. Your application can change. It's not really that big of a deal on Aether because the 2 hits of his charged attack are relatively close. As long as you're not vaping his normal attack, you're doing okay. And I say on Aether because another thing that was brought to my attention, Lumine has higher multipliers, or multiplier rather. The entire normal attack combo and the first hit of her charge attack are the same, but the second hit is 20% higher. No idea why, but this does make having the optimal combos on Lumine just a little bit more important. And I say just a little bit because you still have a large part of your damage coming from your skill and your burst, so if your normals aren't perfectly teched out, it's not the biggest deal. And I like off-field damage, so this is my favorite variation of this team, but you can switch a few units out to get some higher numbers on PMC themselves. Replace Furina and Yelan with Shilinen and Xingqiu. And this is a chance to point out some cool tech I learned. There is the easier setup you can do of using Bennett and then getting the crystallize on Shilonen and then setting up with Xingqiu, which that gets you your 40% damage buff on Pyro Traveler, but it does sacrifice a little bit of uptime on Shilonen. Alternatively, you could start with Xingqiu and just get a Hydro Crystallize. You get better uptime, but worse buffing on PMC. But there is a tricky little setup you can do to start with Xingqiu and still get a Pyro Crystallize. I'll see if I can actually get it. EQE on Xingqiu, or if you're not using Sack Sword, just EQ. Swap to Bennett, do a normal attack for Xingqiu, remove the Hydro R with his E, and apply Pyro with his burst, then swap to Shilonen and get your crystallize. Oh my, I got it first try. It's a lot harder on stream, but I guess it's more consistent than I thought it was. There's also an alternative version you can do if you mess it up using Bennett's C6, where if you lose your Pyro Aura from Bennett Burst, you can do a normal attack on Shilonen and follow it up with a quick skill. And you can see 55 pyro damage bonus. I forgot to get my red shred, but who's watching? And that's obviously a tech that's useful on more characters than just Pyro MC. Xingqiu Bennett Shilonen is a pretty good core for a lot of units. You could also alternatively do a double swirl setup with Kazuha if that's your thing, where because Bennett's burst self-applies Pyro, he'll get a Pyro absorption and swirl both elements. Anyways, before I get on to some other teams, I actually want to talk about a few things that I couldn't do, because I saw that 40% crit damage on plunge attacks, and I got excited, I admit. I never really expected Melt Plunge to work, and just to get it out of the way, non-plunge melt also doesn't work. Pyro Traveler's requirement of having to be in their Night Soul Blessing to get the infusion just kind of messes everything up. Melt Plunge teams do not have a lot of cryo, and they really have to be picky about when they're applying Pyro to consistently get their plunges melted. Both versions of Pyro MC's skill, hold and tap, apply Pyro on their own, and when combined with their normal charged or plunging attacks, whichever you're using in that team, it's too much for any one cryo unit to keep up with. There might be setups you can do with 2 cryo units where you stagger application and get your setups just right, but that sounds very difficult and I couldn't figure anything out. Something I didn't foresee is that Pyro Traveler also has too much Pyro to keep up with your traditional core of Furina Shanyun. If you want to vape all your plunges, you're gonna need another Hydra unit. And that's a lot more feasible than Melt. Just throw in Yelan or Xingqiu and they'll do the job. But to do that, you have to sacrifice a buffing slot and you're gonna see a lot less damage out of your PMC, which is what I expect a lot of people want. Something else that I want to mention, which is somewhat relevant to this team, if you're using Pyro MC as your DPS, they don't really have a great way of applying Pyro to use in your setups. While their skill does remain off field, the fact that their infusion is tied to their skill's duration, it means that if you want to use it to do your setups, you're gonna have to sacrifice uptime on field. Because no matter how many Night Soul points you can generate between their C2 and their burst, their blessing has a hard limit of 12 seconds. How this comes back to this team is that Shanyun is not gonna get a Pyro Swirl, and while I could keep her on VV to help with Furina and Yelan's damage, and that would probably be best overall, I'm gonna swap to a Song of Days Past build, as this is a set that buffs your Onfielder's damage. As you can see, still a very functional team, but it can be a little messy to play. As it was foreseen in the scrolls, we have ororoverload. I brought this up in my original video as a decent core for any Pyro or Electro carry, but with C6 Pyro Traveler, he has become the Pyro carry. Also, realistically, Bennett is probably better than Eon-san here. Ororon is already giving the scroll buff, so Eon-san doesn't have that strength over Bennett, but I'm using her because I can. Also, she makes the team not circle impact, which is nice. I guess I could talk about her a little bit. She has, this talent. At base, she consumes 6 Night Soul every second, and this talent will make her regenerate 1 Night Soul point every second. Every 3 seconds, that 1 is boosted to 4 if you're using a Natlan Onfielder. Over those 3 seconds, that will be 6 Night Soul. It essentially doubles the value of this talent from 1 per second to 2 per second if you're using a Natlan Onfielder. Another instance of Eon-san's kit being way too complex for basically no reason. Anyways, PMC benefits from this talent, so he doesn't need to move as much to keep Eon-san's Night Soul and buff high. I always say the same thing about this team. It doesn't perform the best, but it's easy to play, it's a lot of fun, has a lot of units I like, and also, Ororon was just free, and Chevy and Eon-san are still on the current banner. Topical. The last team is another one I've shown off in a few videos. It's a lot of off-field damage coming from Furina and Emily, which needs a healer and a Pyro Onfielder. In the past, I've done Pyro units that can deal a fair amount of damage themselves, but mostly focus on applying Pyro. PMC gives us the opportunity to use a more supportive unit. And I mean, I guess you could have used Mawika with Scroll in the same slot, but what Mawika player wants to do that? I also was playing around with some other healers instead of Baiju in this slot. It wasn't the best, but my favorite ended up being Dory, because it's Dory. I like using Dory, she's funny. You're probably still better off with Baiju. He provides a lot more fanfare, and he would bring the Dendro Resonance for a little bit of extra EM on Furina. But you know, that isn't nearly insane enough for me. A lot of goofy, silly reaction-based fun. Pyro MC also has the benefit of retaining his infusion as you swap, so you can sorta on-field Dory and Pyro MC. That is, of course, if your Dory is C6. I don't even necessarily know if this team is better with C6 Dory. It probably is because of the healing and fanfare. What I do know is that it is more fun. Anyways, I think that's where I'm gonna cut it off. Hope you learned some new ways to DPS and on-field your Pyro Traveler. If you liked, you can drop a like or subscribe to let me know. And I hope y'all have a lovely day.